No order in the Imperium of Man carried more authority, more secrecy, or more fear than the Inquisition. For 10,000 years, that combination was the only thing standing between humanity and total destruction. They hunted demons, aliens, and traitors across 1,000,000 worlds, answering to no one but the Emperor himself. A single agent could walk into a room and override the orders of a planetary governor, command a warship without authorization, or send an entire world to its death with no one to stop them. Operating in the shadows, making decisions that no official record would ever capture, they carried the weight of truths the rest of humanity was never permitted to know. But the longer you follow their story, the harder it becomes to believe the Holy Orders were simply the protectors they claimed to be. Every power they gained to stop their enemies slowly pushed them closer to becoming one. Every crisis they survived made the next one worse instead of better. Agents who lasted long enough built private armies, consulted forbidden texts, and made bargains that would have sentenced anyone else to death. An institution with no real system to stop them, no central authority to draw a line and hold it, and no honest answer to the question of where protecting humanity ended and threatening it began. The organization spent 10,000 years shaped by that absence of an answer. To understand how that happened, we have to go back to the moment the Inquisition was born. In the middle of the worst betrayal in human history, when a dying civilization needed watchers it could never fully control, and a man named Malcador the Sigillite began building them in the dark. Chapter 1. Origins and Shadow. Imperial records disagree on the precise moment the Holy Orders were formally created. Many accounts place its emergence around the time of the Emperor's interment within the Golden Throne, and several versions credit an order from the Emperor to his closest advisor to found it. What those accounts agree on is the crisis that made it necessary. Malcador understood, before almost anyone else did, that the Horus Heresy was not simply a military crisis. Armies could be rebuilt, worlds could be retaken, but the kind of corruption that had turned the War Master and half the Emperor's sons against their father was something that no army had ever been built to fight. Because it did not attack from the outside, it grew from within, wearing the faces of loyal soldiers right up until the moment it did not need to anymore. What the region needed were people who had already faced that kind of betrayal and survived it. People who knew what the enemy looked like from the inside. Nathaniel Garro was exactly that kind of person. He was a high-ranking officer of the Death Guard, one of the Emperor's Space Marine legions. And when his legion fell to corruption during the opening years of the Heresy, he refused to go with them. He escaped on a damaged ship, carrying the first warning of the betrayal to the throne world. And when he arrived, the man who met him was not the Emperor or any of his sons. It was the Sigillite. Rather than simply debriefing the former officer and sending him back to the front, the Regent gave him a new purpose entirely, because he had already begun building something in the dark that would outlast the war itself, and he needed people like him at the center of it. In the years before the Heresy, the Imperium had seemed unstoppable. Alongside the Emperor, his 20 superhuman sons led what history called a Great Crusade across the galaxy, pushing back centuries of darkness and bringing scattered human worlds under a single banner. Beneath that expansion, however, the Emperor understood something his servants did not. Greatest among the threats to humanity were not always armies on distant worlds. Some grew from within the Imperium itself, and some came from the hidden spirit realm beneath physical reality that later generations would call the Warp, a dark and unstable place where human emotions and corruption took physical form. Both men recognized that the Imperium needed more than soldiers. Then, the Heresy began, and that recognition became urgent. Malcador's answer was to build a network in the dark, away from official records and public knowledge, because that was the only place it could survive. In the book, The Buried Dagger, the Regent is shown communicating with his most trusted agents, not through messengers or written orders. He used telepathic projections, sending images of himself across the throne world without leaving his own guarded chambers. This was not simply caution, it reflected something basic about what he was building. An organization that worked in the space between what the Imperium believed was happening and what was actually happening, doing work that formal Imperial rule could not acknowledge and sometimes could not even see. Garro became one of the first members of the group at the center of that network, an elite force called the Knights Errant. The novel Garro makes clear that each of these fighters carried the region's personal mark etched into their armor, giving them authority to override any ranked officer and move freely across a planet falling apart around them. Some had escaped from armies that turned traitor, as the Death Guard survivor had. Others had been chosen because the Regent needed warriors who owed their loyalty to the mission alone, not to any unit or chain of command that might one day conflict with his orders. Tylos Rubio had been taken from the Ultramarines for his exceptional psychic ability. Garviel Loken, once a captain in Horus's own personal force, had watched the betrayal unfold from the inside. Macer Varen came from the World Eaters before that legion descended into madness. Each of them had left their former lives behind entirely. That was the point. Beyond those warrior agents, the region also maintained a broader network of human operatives known as its Chosen, people working entirely outside the normal chain of Imperial authority, using stealth devices that bent light and confused sensors, moving through hidden passages beneath the Imperial Palace that appeared in no official record. They passed orders through channels no other organization could access. Beneath even that layer, gray-clad agents known as the Order Elucidatum served as censors, enforcers, and secret police throughout the Heresy, existing to remove information, silence witnesses, and erase evidence of events the wider Imperium could not safely know about. The anthology, the Horus Heresy Book 8, Malevolence, records that the Order Elucidatum was formally resolved in 012 M31, wiped from the record as though it had never existed, but its surviving members were quietly moved into other hidden agencies, carrying their skills into new structures that would eventually grow into the formal institution. Nothing about this organization simply appeared from nothing. It was built from people who already knew how to make things disappear. Alongside these networks, two other forces operated during the Heresy that would shape what came next. Among them were the Sisters of Silence, an all-female force of warriors who carried no psychic presence whatsoever, hunting unauthorized psychics and enforcing the Emperor's restrictions with a thoroughness no other group could match. Alongside them operated a specialized force called the Ordo Sinister, dedicated to stopping the most dangerous class of psychic threat. Neither group was the institution yet. Both were doing the work it would one day inherit, and the people within them were learning lessons that would shape everything that followed. This combined effort carried a name: the Silent War. The Regent believed that winning the Heresy through military force alone was not enough, because if everything that made humanity worth saving was lost in the process of saving it, the victory would mean nothing. That belief shaped operations that made no conventional military sense at all. One mission sent Garro and other agents to recover the Rosetta Stone from a region of Terra called Gyptus while armies clashed across the planet above ground. Having no military value, the object nonetheless represented the continuity of human language and memory, and the region considered that worth protecting, even in the middle of a war for survival. These agents were not simply weapons, they were a living memory, built to carry something of human civilization forward, even if the war went completely wrong. However, the Silent War was not only about preservation. His team also tracked rebels working inside the Imperium to aid the traitor forces, and they targeted unauthorized religious gatherings, secret churches forming around the idea of the Emperor as a divine being. Dangerous for a reason most people could not have anticipated, these gatherings drew creatures from the spirit realm toward their locations simply through the fear behind the worship. More genuine terror sent a stronger signal beyond physical reality, pulling things toward those gathering places that the worshippers had no ability to fight off. Raiding a chapel could trigger the very appearance of dark side forces the agents were trying to prevent. Every decision carried that risk, and either choice could produce results that were impossible to undo. Being identified as the Lord of Flies made that risk permanent. It appeared again and again across multiple locations as a herald of chaos that seemed specifically drawn to the region's network and its work. Finding and destroying it once was not possible. It appeared in different forms, at different places, targeting agents and their operations with a regularity that pointed to something actively directing it toward them. Its presence took physical forms that mirrored the corruption spreading through the Imperium, including insect swarms moving with a single shared purpose, physical changes spreading through victims without warning, and the particular horror known as the Flyblown. Ordinary people transformed by a dark venom into something that no longer functioned as a person at all, mindless and driven entirely by the dark energy that had reshaped them. Facing that threat forced the agents to accept something that would define the organization for 10,000 years. Wearing any face, holding any rank, the most dangerous individuals were often the ones who had not yet shown what they truly were. The Death Guard survivor had seen this process firsthand with his own legion. Corruption had consumed the Death Guard, not as an open attack, but as something that crept through the army slowly, reshaping warriors from the inside until transformation was complete and resistance was impossible. That same process had been playing out across the other legions through a system of private gatherings called lodges, meetings that started as harmless bonds between warriors, but became the mechanism through which the War Master spread his influence one quiet oath at a time, in spaces their superiors had no visibility into. By the time the loyal forces understood what the lodges truly were, the betrayal had gone too deep to stop from within any single army. Secret bonds of loyalty had been used to corrupt a devoted force from the inside, and that lesson would define how the organization approached threats for the next 10,000 years. On humanity's home world, paranoia spread through the population like a second infection running alongside the physical threats. Citizens and leaders alike saw betrayal in every unexplained absence and every face that seemed slightly wrong. Agents of the region worked in this environment daily, holding their cover against suspicious neighbors, their composure under real attacks, and their judgment against the pressure to treat every small irregularity as an immediate emergency. Meanwhile, the Emperor's son Rogal Dorn transformed the Imperial Palace into a total fortress, tearing down buildings that had stood for generations and replacing them with weapon positions, defensive walls, and reinforced barriers. Physical defenses could not address everything. Beneath the palace, in areas sealed against what pressed in from the spirit realm, a second defense was operating, one that most of the Emperor's own servants were not permitted to know about. When the traitor's fleet arrived in the Sol system, Malcador made his final move. He gathered 12 of his most trusted people. 8 were warrior agents, psychic fighters trained specifically to fight what was coming, and they were taken in secret to the distant moon of Titan to begin the long process of becoming something the Imperium had never produced before. 4 were mortal humans who would carry the foundations of the organization forward. A man who would be known as Prometheus, a woman named Moriana with deep knowledge of the Dark Realm, a former speaker for Horus's own fleet who had defected to the Emperor's side and taken the new name Veritas, and a 4th individual whose name was lost even to the institution's own later research. Among the Knights Errant who remained, Garro continued his work until the Regent himself was gone. As the Emperor moved to face the fallen sun directly, the Sigillite took his place on the Golden Throne, the vast machine that sustained the psychic signal, guiding Imperial ships through the warp, and holding that position cost him his life. When the Emperor returned, broken beyond any recovery his servants had expected, the man who had built what would become the institution was already dead. The siege of Terra ended not with celebration, but with silence. What remained was 4 mortal humans carrying the weight of everything he had started, and they did not carry it together for long. Chapter 2. After the Heresy. He had built the network with one purpose: protect humanity from threats the Imperium cannot see coming, but he had never told the 4 founders what protecting humanity actually meant. And the moment he was gone, that question had no answer anyone agreed on. Each of the 4 had survived the Heresy differently. Each had seen different parts of what the enemy was capable of, and each had reached a different conclusion about what the organization they were now carrying needed to become. Those differences pulled them apart almost immediately, and the split that began between 4 people in the silence after the Siege of Terra would eventually become a divide that ran through the entire institution for 10,000 years. Codex Inquisition details that 2 of the founders, Prometheus and Moriana, believed the Imperium could not survive without the Emperor's direct leadership and committed themselves to finding a way to restore him to life. The other two argued the Imperium had to keep working in his absence, and that someone had to ensure the structure did not collapse while it tried to do that. None of this was about loyalty. All four founders wanted to protect humanity. However, what they believed that protection actually required was different enough to pull the organization in four directions from its very first day. And those directions would harden over centuries into groups that fought each other as hard as they fought anything else. Prometheus and Moriana left Terra together, searching for any path that might lead to the Emperor's restoration, but their methods separated quickly and for good, seeking answers from the spirit realm itself, reaching into its forbidden knowledge if she believed it might produce results. She pushed further than her companion was willing to accept. Prometheus had watched the Heresy consume people who reached too far into that darkness. He recognized in her growing desperation a willingness to pay costs that could never be undone. After several direct clashes, he broke from her completely. She vanished into the Eye of Terror, and later Imperial sources would refer to her as the Crone Moriana, an ancient traitor still active within that dark realm, consumed by the very forces she had once tried to use as tools. Her fate became a warning that agents referenced for centuries. The most dangerous path was always the one that began with the best intentions. Her disappearance did not end the Founder's mission, it only made it more urgent. Fearful that she might release powers of chaos to achieve her goal before she vanished, he had already built a small, dedicated group of followers specifically to oppose the danger she represented. When she was gone, that group turned its energy toward the same restoration goal through safer means, carrying his mission forward across the galaxy while he continued searching. Over centuries, the original purpose remained, but the path toward it became harder to define, and the followers he had gathered drifted through the galaxy hunting whatever threats crossed their path while keeping the Emperor's return as their core mission. Then came a discovery no one had anticipated. That same codex confirms that a group called the Promeans were found fighting a dark power threat in a distant part of the galaxy. When contact was made, neither side realized the connection, and only later did the historical record reveal the truth. This chance meeting had created the first formal revival faction within the Holy Orders, descended directly from one of its own founders, absorbed back into the institution without anyone knowing they had been part of its story since the very beginning. Meanwhile, the two founders who had stayed on Terra were building the structure that would carry everything forward. Their first problem was that the organization had no official standing in the Imperium's new governing structure. In the novel Watchers of the Throne, the Emperor's Legion, the period after the siege saw the formation of a new ruling council, a gathering of high lords who would govern the Imperium in the Emperor's physical absence. Built entirely outside any formal chain of authority, answering only to the Emperor personally, the Holy Orders needed recognition, or other institutions would challenge them constantly. A representative was placed in the council chamber, identifying himself as speaking for the most holy orders of the Emperor's institution, and from that moment, the organization was made a fixed part of how the Imperium was run. What the region had built in secret now had formal authority to operate in the open, and that transition changed everything about what the organization could do and what it would become. Real power came with that position. Shaped like a stylized column drawn from the region's own personal mark, the seal represented the right to demand anything from anyone. Because it carried the Emperor's authority, no institution in the Imperium held formal grounds to refuse it, and forging one carried some of the harshest punishments the sealed orders could deliver. It was never to be surrendered, never copied, and never treated as anything less than the direct expression of the Emperor's own right to act. The founder and those who carried his mission forward understood what that seal represented for their own goal. As long as the institution survived and held that authority, the search for the Emperor's restoration had a foundation to operate from. That understanding shaped the early culture of the organization in ways that were not always visible, giving the founders a reason to build structures that were meant to last far beyond any single agent's lifetime. Among the most important of those structures was a formal relationship with the Black Ships. The Dark Heresy core rulebook details that these vessels, operated under the authority of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, traveled throughout the Imperium, collecting people who had shown psychic ability, bringing them to Terra to be divided into two groups. Some were trained for approved service, Others were sacrificed to sustain the Golden Throne and the psychic signal it powered, the beacon that allowed Imperial ships to navigate the warp safely. Without that signal, the Imperium's ability to hold itself together across a million worlds would have been severely threatened, and the Holy Order's authority over the institutions involved in that process gave the Watchers a hold on power that no other single organization could match. But that power came with a dependency that would never go away. Ships from the Imperial Navy, weapons from the Tech Priest Order known as the Adeptus Mechanicus, and soldiers from the great armies of the Imperium were all things the Sealed Orders needed, which meant pushing too hard against any of those institutions would eventually leave the Hunters unable to do their actual work. That tension between formal unlimited authority and practical day-to-day reality became a permanent feature of every agent's career. Membership within the ranks was never set by a fixed standard. A promising person might reach a senior agent's attention through exceptional service or years of reliable work, and after step-by-step testing and gradually more important duties, their mentor could sponsor their full acceptance. Once accepted, a new Inquisitor was formally equal to the most senior lord in the institution from their first day, but that equality meant very little without the reputation to back it up. A hunter who had spent 30 years building relationships and delivering results had far more practical power than the one who had received their seal 3 weeks earlier. So reputation became the real mechanism through which authority worked in the world. Every operative was constantly building it, spending it, and protecting it, often in ways that had nothing to do with fighting the enemy. One institution that did not share the Holy Order's rise was the force of warrior women known as the Sisters of Silence, allowed to shrink and fade from the wider Imperium's awareness for centuries after the Heresy ended. They were largely forgotten by the governing structures that had once relied on them. Knowledge of what they had been capable of became limited to the Sealed Order's own records, and that quiet disappearance was a decision that would cost the organization dearly far later, when events produced a crisis that made their specific abilities desperately needed, and a formal recall had to be issued to bring them back from generations of near-total obscurity. Through all of this, the belief base split from the Founding continued to harden, refusing the methods of the enemy and holding to standards that made it different from what it fought was the strict position. Using forbidden knowledge against the enemy as a practical tool was the flexible one. Both sides had strong arguments. Neither could fully answer the other. Because neither side could answer the other, both kept pushing further, and that escalation would eventually produce agents who had crossed so far past the line they started on that they could no longer remember where it had been. But before that happened, the organization had to survive something it had never anticipated and had no system to address it at all. Chapter 3: Rise of the Ordos. 8 warriors the region had sent to Titan did not arrive as finished soldiers. They arrived as people who had survived betrayal and been chosen for exactly that reason, carrying his purpose into a place so remote that the rest of the Imperium had no awareness they existed. What they became over the centuries that followed was something the Imperium had never produced before. Warriors built from the ground up to fight a single kind of enemy, trained so completely for that purpose that the training itself was a form of danger. Designed to do something that most people believe was impossible, the process they underwent on Titan required them to make direct contact with the worst things the Dark Realm could produce, and survive that contact without being changed by it. Eventually, those warriors became the dedicated military force of the Ordo Malleus when that branch of the institution was formally established centuries later. But in the meantime, the organization they were preparing to serve still had to survive a threat that would change it permanently. In the 32nd millennium, an orc force unlike anything seen since the Great Crusade emerged from deep within the galaxy. As seen in the Codex Demon Hunters, it was an organized assault directed by a single being of great power, known as the Beast, coordinated in a way that this species, known for having no order or discipline, almost never achieved. Reaching Terra itself, the attack struck at the heart of the Imperium with a force that left the defenders looking for answers they did not have. Never since the Siege of Terra had the Imperium come closer to total destruction, and this time, the enemy was not the Dark Powers, it was something the Holy Orders in their current form were simply not built to fight. So the Inquisition changed permanently. It formally split into two major branches that would define its structure for the next 8,000 years. First was the Ordo Malleus, continuing the original mission of fighting the ruinous forces and the demonic beings they unleashed, with those warriors from Titan now fully formed as its dedicated military arm. Second was the Ordo Xenos, dedicated entirely to the alien threat, studying it, tracking it, and destroying it. Each branch developed its own methods, its own specialized knowledge, and its own dedicated military force. However, that specialization also meant each branch now had something to protect beyond the mission, its own identity, its own approach, and its own view of what the organization was for. Beyond these two major branches, countless smaller ordos operated in the shadows alongside them. Among them, the Ordo Chronos, dedicated to the study of temporal anomalies, and the Ordo Sicarius, which monitored the Imperial Assassination Agency. Each pursued its own narrow mission, answering to no central authority, adding new layers to an institution that was already nearly impossible to govern from the outside. The internal divide that had existed since the founding did not disappear. It simply found two new homes and two new sets of tools to fight with. Demon Hunters of the Ordo Malleus carried the legacy of those 8 warriors forward. The novel The Emperor's Gift details what made the Grey Knights unique among all Space Marine forces. Some theories and the legends surrounding their creation say that their genetic material did not come from any of the Emperor's sons, but from the Emperor himself, making them a force with no direct equal anywhere in the Imperium's armed forces. Every one of them was a psychic warrior of real power, and each suit of armor they carried was part of a system known collectively as the Aegis. Hulls laced with circuitry and warding symbols, psychoreactive and designed to channel psychic power while resisting the corrupting influence of the Dark Realm. Physically burned with acid into the palms and armor of every Grey Knight, the Founder's Mark made the connection between the institution's origin and its most powerful military force permanent and visible on every warrior who carried it. Preparation for this role went far beyond standard Space Marine training. Called the Rituals of Detestation, their training involved direct confrontations with the worst things the hidden dimension could produce, repeated until exposure no longer carried the same corrupting weight it did for others. Building agents who could stand next to a demon and not become it was the goal. However, that goal required absolute secrecy to work. Any forces who fought alongside them were subject to immediate memory removal or permanent reassignment afterward, and in some cases, witnesses were simply killed. Effectiveness depended entirely on an enemy that did not know they were coming, which meant the organization was now actively removing the memories of its own allies to protect one of its greatest assets, and the people whose memories were removed had no way to object to something they were no longer permitted to remember. Along entirely different lines, the Ordo Xenos developed its own approach, shaped by a threat that required a completely different kind of preparation. Where the demon hunting branch built warriors who could face the Dark Realm and survive it, the alien hunting arm built specialists who spent years, sometimes decades, learning a single enemy species before engaging it directly. Consider a Space Marine who had trained his entire career against one kind of enemy and then receive orders to join the Death Watch. Leaving his chapter behind, he would take up black armor, marking him as apart from his brothers, and spend years fighting species he had never encountered, learning their patterns and weaknesses through direct experience. When he finally returned to his brothers, he carried knowledge that could not have been gained any other way. According to the Codex Supplement, Death Watch, formally created through a specific agreement between senior agents and respected Space Marine chapter masters, the Death Watch was the product of careful planning rather than wartime improvisation. That experience, accumulated by warriors from many different forces, serving together and then returning home, spread through the broader Space Marine community over time, improving the Imperium's capacity to respond to alien threats that no single group would ever face alone. As these two branches grew stronger, the split inside the organization grew sharper. Most extreme among the expressions of that divide was the practice of creating a demon-bound vessel, a process in which a demonic being was forced inside a living human body and used as a weapon or a source of forbidden information. Strict agents considered this the clearest possible sign that a flexible operative had crossed into something unforgivable, while flexible agents who practiced it argued that a bound demon capable of destroying other demons was simply a tool, and that refusing to use it was its own kind of failure. Never settled, this argument persisted because the institution had no central authority capable of making final decisions on questions like this, and that absence was not an oversight. It was a design choice rooted in the belief that using different methods was a strength. But a design choice that prevents a final answer also prevents correction, and what that meant in practice was that the most dangerous debates inside the organization could never be closed, only escalated. Soon, the debate over methods would be pushed aside entirely, because someone inside the Imperium's own governing structure had noticed the gap in the organization's attention and had already decided how to use it. Chapter 4: Age of Conflicts. Built to watch for threats the Imperium's other institutions could not see coming, the Holy Orders had nonetheless developed a blind spot they had never fully addressed. They watched outward. Aliens, demonic forces, and hidden heresies spreading through the population were what the hunters tracked. What the organization had not built a consistent system to watch was the Imperium's own centers of power, the governing bodies and religious structures that held the whole civilization together. That blind spot was about to be exposed in the most damaging way possible by a single man who had been watching long enough to understand exactly where the gap was. Goch Van Dyer held the position of High Lord of the Administratum, which gave him control over the vast system that ran the Imperium's day-to-day operations. That alone made him one of the most powerful individuals in the galaxy. Then, he seized the position of Ecclesiarch, the highest rank in the Church of the Emperor, and became something far more dangerous. Codex Adeptus Sororitas makes clear that no single person had ever held combined control over both the governing machine and the religious authority of the Imperium at the same time. Both institutions had been kept deliberately separate for exactly this reason. Now they were not, and the sealed orders had not caught the warning signs of what was actually building inside the church until the tyrant's position was already too strong to challenge directly. What followed was the most brutal period of internal collapse since the Horus Heresy. Known to history as the Reign of Blood, the tyrant's rule was defined by mass killings and the use of religious authority to justify violence against anyone who challenged his position. He turned an all-female warrior order called the Daughters of the Emperor into his personal guard, using their total commitment to the Emperor's will as a weapon pointed at his own people. They served him faithfully because they had been convinced his commands came from a divine source, and their genuine devotion made them more dangerous than any mercenary force could have been. His control over the Daughters was finally broken, not by a military campaign, but by a single act. The Emperor's Golden Warriors, the Adeptus Custodes, personally escorted the Daughters' leader, Alicia Dominica, to the Golden Throne itself. What the dying Emperor shared with her there was never recorded in any surviving document, but she emerged knowing the truth, returned to the tyrant directly, and killed him in his own audience chamber. The Reign of Blood ended in a single room with a single action. Ending the crisis, however, did not erase the failure that had allowed it. Because the organization had been watching outward, it had missed a threat growing at the center of the Imperium's own religious structure, and that failure required a structural answer. In the aftermath, strict measures were put in place to ensure that no single individual could again hold combined control over both the governing machine and the religious authority of the Imperium at the same time. That separation, which Van Dyer had broken, was now enforced rather than simply assumed. In Codex Witch Hunters, the Ordo Hereticus emerged directly from that gap. Known as the Witch Hunters, their mission covered both the tracking of unauthorized psychics and dangerous mutations within the population, and the ongoing monitoring of the Imperium's own leading institutions. Catching warning signs before they became crises rather than after was the job. To do that work, a formal agreement established that the all-female warrior order, now renamed the Adeptus Sororitas or Sisters of Battle, would serve at the disposal of agents in good standing. Watching the Watchers was now part of the mission, but every new branch the organization grew was also a new source of disagreement about what the institution was actually for. By the 36th millennium, those disagreements had hardened into factions so different from each other that some could barely be called call part of the same organization at all. Largest among these factions were the Amalathians, who held that the Imperium was allowing a plan laid down by the Emperor and that the right response to any crisis was to preserve existing structures rather than change them. That philosophy had real results. It developed on a world called Thalamor at a place called Mount Amalath, and the ideas that came from that location would eventually inspire military leaders across the following millennia. Among them, Lord Solar Macarius, who conquered nearly 1,000 new worlds in 7 years during the 41st millennium. However, the Amalathian commitment to preserving existing structures also meant that every broken or corrupt part of the Imperium was treated as something to be maintained rather than fixed. At the far extreme, the Mono-Dominants believed the Imperium was the only civilization with a right to exist in the galaxy at all, ordering total planetary destruction more readily than any other group, using the organization's most absolute authority as a first response rather than a last resort. So vast was the distance between those two positions that operatives from each group sometimes spent as much energy opposing colleagues as opposing actual threats. Most dangerous of all, one faction did not simply argue its position, it acted on it in ways that crossed lines most agents refused to approach. The book The Horusian Wars Resurrection documents that the Horusians grew from within the flexible Xanthite tradition, taking the belief in using the enemy's power one step further than almost anyone else was willing to go. If the ruinous forces could be used as a tool, they reasoned. Perhaps the very process that had transformed Horus into an avatar of those powers could be adapted to give the Emperor a new body to inhabit. Their research involved studying forbidden texts connected to the traitor's transformation, drawing on knowledge that even many flexible agents considered too close to outright betrayal to accept. That reasoning led directly to the kind of internal violence that the organization had no system to address. That same account reveals that an inquisitor named Idris deliberately arranged the killing of her colleagues at a gathering called the Conclave of Iro, removing opposition by eliminating the people who stood against her plans. Having no dedicated group for investigating crimes committed by agents against each other, the institution resolved cases like this through personal confrontation, political pressure, and in some cases, further violence. By the time the 41st millennium arrived, some of the institution's internal conflicts had cost more lives than the external threats the organization was built to address. Agents that environment produced had learned to act on incomplete information, make permanent decisions under pressure, and trust their own judgment over anything else. Extraordinarily capable, they were also extraordinarily dangerous, and the story of the Sealed Orders at the height of their power was really the story of what happened to the people inside the organization and what it cost them to stay there. Chapter 5. Power and Fear. Factions the institution had spent 2,000 years building did not simply exist as ideas. They produced specific kinds of agents with specific methods, and those agents carry those methods into institutions where the consequences were permanent. Two of the most studied figures in the organization's history show what that actually looked like in practice. One who started with strict principles and crossed too many lines in the name of necessity that his former peers eventually declared him a heretic, and one who held to a cold and fixed view of the mission his entire career and applied it to everything around him, including the institution he served. Both began in the same place, with the same seal and the same stated purpose. What they became shows how much the environment shaped the person. Gregor Eisenhorn had spent nearly 2 centuries hunting humanity's enemies by the time his name became the most studied example in the organization's history of how a principled agent could destroy himself through choices that each seemed reasonable in the moment. That story, told across the Eisenhorn series, captures more clearly than any official record what the Watchers at the height of their power actually looked like from the inside, and what the cost of that power was for the people who carried it. He began his career as a strict Amalathian, committed to preserving the Imperium's stability, and his team reflected his methods. A data-focused savant named Uber Amos handled intelligence analysis, while Elizabeth Beckwin carried no psychic presence whatsoever, making her completely invisible to hostile minds searching for the group. Medea Betancourt's skills as a pilot extended far beyond flying their transport, and together, they were built to operate across entire regions for extended periods without outside support. But as the threats they faced grew larger, the methods had to grow to match them, and that is where everything started moving in one direction. Carrying that seal meant the ability to override planetary security systems, demand access to restricted records, and command military assets assets without authorization from anyone. A planet-designated ghoul was destroyed by an Imperial fleet under the Institution's order, eliminated to ensure the secrets of a demonic ruler remain permanently buried. Another world was destroyed to prevent the recovery of a forbidden text called the Necrotuque. Once an operative issued the order for total planetary destruction, it cannot be outdone, even if people on the surface were still alive when the attack began, because reversing it would undermine every similar order given before and after. Each decision the veteran agent made was defensible in isolation, but each one also moved him further from the standard he had started with. That distance was not something he chose all at once. It was something that grew, one necessary decision at a time. In the Ravenor series, this same pattern played out in his most capable student. During an event called the Thracian Atrocity, a heretical attack destroyed most of Gideon Ravenor's physical body. But the student survived within a steel support chair, his body gone, but his mind remained fully intact. He continued to operate as a full agent through mental projection and the work of his retinue, which included a veteran soldier named Harlan Nail, a skilled interrogator named Carlthonius, and Patience Kiss, an operative who could move objects with her mind. Also within the group was Wiston Fraka, whose mind was completely invisible to psychic detection, creating a protective void around the team that masked their presence from hostile minds that would otherwise have tracked the powerful signal the contained agent generated simply by existing. That the Holy Orders accepted his continued service said something important about what they valued. Physical condition meant nothing. Quality of the mind and commitment to the mission were what mattered. During a significant part of his career, the team operated under a status called Special Condition, a formal label that treated them as effectively not existing within the organization's official records, allowed to continue their work under the protection of their results, while agents who disagreed with their methods sent observers to monitor and, in some cases, actively blocked their operations without any formal process to justify it. A different face of the same organization appeared through the senior witch hunter Erasmus Crowell. Where the Amalathian had started with principles and moved away from them under pressure, the witch hunter held to a fixed view of the mission from the beginning and applied it to everything without exception. Pale, thin, and deliberate, the senior agent operated from a private fortress called Corvain on Terra itself, equipped with filtered air systems, interrogation chambers, and automated weapons that tracked any unauthorized approach. His working belief was simple. Innocence was possible. Everyone within the Imperium had made compromises, and the only question was whether those compromises mattered to his current investigation. That belief made him remarkably effective, but it also meant he applied the same framework to the people around him that he applied to enemies of the state. And the line between those two categories was sometimes only a matter of which file he was reading. Perhaps the most complete illustration of how far that trouble could go was an event known as the Months of Shame. The first war for Armageddon ended with a successful defense against a massive demonic attack, but afterward the sealed orders issued a command for the forced removal and permanent imprisonment of the entire surviving civilian population, with the world to be resettled by new colonists who had never witnessed demonic activity. Allowing survivors to live freely would spread knowledge of what had happened, and that knowledge itself was considered more dangerous than the lives of the people carrying it. Refusing this order, the Space Wolves had fought alongside those civilians and watched them survive through genuine courage, and the warriors escorted the survivors off the planet rather than allowing them to be taken. Forces from both sides fired on each other's ships, and the conflict reached the chapter's home world before more measured voices on both sides pulled it back from becoming a full war. That same novel also records that the agent who had overseen the Armageddon operation later acknowledged that the Holy Orders were not a unified will, but a collection of individuals whose beliefs could conflict violently with each other. What one called a necessary measure, another might call something that could never be forgiven. Because of that conflict, Eisenhorn's own career took on new meaning. Over nearly 2 centuries, the veteran agent moved from strict Amalathian discipline to something his former peers declared heretical. He bound a demonic being called Cherubale inside a human body and used it as a weapon, and he consulted a forbidden text called the Malus Codicium, which the institution officially considered too dangerous for even its own agents to read. Enemies like the renegade Quixos required those methods to stop. He had once been regarded as one of the Order's greatest operatives before slipping into heresy and planning a weapon that would collapse the Eye of Terror, a weapon that would have worked, but at the cost of millions of lives near the boundary. The veteran agent stopped him, but the cost of doing so was part of what eventually made others see the veteran agent as no better than the man he had destroyed. Agents like Commodus Voke showed the other path. Holding firmly to his principles his entire career, he died in direct combat against a demon-bound vessel, never crossing the line others crossed in the name of necessity. Both kinds of agents had started in the same place, with the same seal and the same stated purpose. What was coming next would make the difference between them nearly impossible to hold, because the scale of the crisis about to hit the Imperium would push every operative still alive towards the very choices that had destroyed the ones who came before them. Chapter 6. Endless War. Erasmus Crowell was reviewing a report on unauthorized psychic activity in the sublevels of Terra when the signal disappeared, not gradually, but all at once. Then, Cadia fell. That single event, the loss of the ancient fortress world that had held back the Eye of Terror for thousands of years, broke barriers that had stood since the Horus Heresy. In the novel Avenging Son, when those barriers collapsed, the war poured into physical reality across the entire galaxy at once, tearing a wound so vast it split the Imperium in two. On one side lay the portion still connected to Terra and the great psychic beacon that guided Imperial ships safely through it. On the other lay what became known as the Dark Imperium, cut off behind storms of chaotic energy, its worlds isolated and their fates unknown to anyone beyond the Divide. The senior agent had spent decades as a witch hunter, operating on the assumption that no single event could break the structure he served. That assumption was gone. The great psychic beacon went dark, leaving every fleet that depended on it stranded, and large parts of Terra itself into open violence and unrest as hidden groups that had been waiting for this kind of collapse moved into action. Known as the Days of Blindness, this period hit the organization at its most vulnerable point. The book Vaults of Terra, the Hollow Mountain, details how the qualities that had made the institution effective for so long, its spread out structure and reliance on individual authority, became serious weaknesses in a situation that demanded coordinated response across an entire planet at once. Communication systems failed or became overloaded. Messages were delayed hours or days, lost entirely, or trapped in repeating cycles. Agents who had operated with confidence in relative independence found themselves genuinely cut off, making permanent decisions in conditions of complete uncertainty that would previously have required careful consultation with peers. On Terra, the senior agent worked in exactly those conditions, his intelligence networks producing broken reports he could not confirm or cross-reference, until the picture those reports formed pointed towards something he had not expected to find at the center of his own organization. What the pressure exposed was something that had always been there beneath the surface. Lord Inquisitor Adamara Rosillo was one of the most senior agents on Terra, a woman whose career spanned generations of service and whose judgment had been trusted through crises that most operatives would never survive. Quietly and alone, she had also reached a conclusion that the institution she led had failed to reach collectively. The Golden Throne was not simply getting worse, failing faster than anyone was admitting publicly. It had no real solution that did not involve borrowing time. That did not exist. Her response was to arrange a forbidden deal. She brought a Dark Eldar Flesh Shaper to the capital world, a specialist in biological and mechanical changes from one of the most cruel and corrupt alien species in the galaxy, to advise on the throne's maintenance, not as a prisoner, but as a consultant allowed inside the heart of the Imperial Palace. When Crowell uncovered the arrangement and confirmed it, he did not immediately act. He read the reports twice, he thought about the decades of service behind her name, and considered what the throne's failure would mean for the beacon, and what the beacon's failure meant for every fleet still trying to navigate through the dark void above them. He understood why she had done it. That understanding was the part that stayed with him longest. Then, he executed her, standing in a chamber that still carried the weight of a career spent in genuine service. The senior witch hunter made a decision that the organization's rules demanded and that no official process had authorized authorized him to make. No court could convene quickly enough, no council could weigh the evidence before the damage spread further. Only the seal he carried remained, the authority it represented, and the recognition that an operative of her seniority reaching this conclusion was the clearest possible sign of how desperate things had truly become. His trainee, Spinoza, asked him afterward whether he had made the right call, and he told her that he made the only call available. Those were not the same thing, and they both understood that. Beyond her impact, the alien threat had embedded itself deeper than anyone had realized. Dark Elder operatives had been found in the lowest levels of Terra itself, using tunnels beneath the surface to breed manufactured biological weapons built specifically for destruction, growing there undetected until they were already embedded in the foundations of the most important world in the Imperium. Hidden on Luna, the moon of the capital world, a portal had been secretly opened to allow alien movement within reach of the Emperor's world itself. The Holy Orders had not known it existed. Meanwhile, an agent named Rostov of the alien hunting branch uncovered a plot in which devices made from a rare dark mineral called Noctilith, a material capable of physically damaging the boundary between real space and the hidden dimension, were being used to extend the Great Rift towards vital worlds. Interrogating captured traitor space marines revealed a human agent coordinating the entire plan on behalf of those ruinous forces, known only as the Hand of Abaddon, whose stated goal was to pull the entire galaxy into that dark void. Not a local threat, it was a coordinated attack on the physical fabric of reality itself, carried out by an enemy who had been planning it for longer than any record could account for. The Witch Hunter received these reports in fragments, each one arriving incomplete and out of sequence, and what they described together was an Imperium being taken apart from every direction at once. Operatives working within the Indomitus Crusade, the massive military campaign launched to reclaim lost territory and support isolated forces across the galaxy, faced an additional problem that made coordination nearly impossible, even when communications worked, distorting the passage of time so severely that ships from the same fleet could arrive at the same destination years or even decades apart. The Spirit Realm forced each fleet to establish its own internal timekeeping just to work out when its ships had actually arrived versus when they were supposed to. With the Great Rift open and demonic forces appearing in plain sight across billions of worlds, keeping the general population ignorant of what they were facing was no longer possible. Secrecy that had protected the institution's methods and justified its most extreme measures for thousands of years was gone. Because of that, agents arriving at a world to investigate demonic activity found that the population already knew from direct experience what they were facing, and without that secrecy, every decision the sealed orders had made in the dark looked different in the light. Inside the organization, cracks widened fast. Cleopatra Arx, the Holy Order's representative, dispatched an agent to hunt and contain the Witch Hunter and his trainee Spinoza, not because they had committed any violation, but because their investigation had crossed into territory that powerful figures within the Holy Orders wanted to keep quiet. Corvain was successfully invaded by an armed group, and to clear the building, his trainee enacted a last resort plan, flooding the lower levels with a nerve agent that killed about a third of the loyal personnel who had not been able to get out in time. A fortified stronghold had been turned into a killing ground by the people who were supposed to be protecting it. The senior agent walked the cleared levels afterward. Secured, the building stood, but the personnel who had not made it out had served him for years, and the cost of keeping the fortress was something he carried from that point on. As the crisis deepened, the Adeptus Custodes began moving outward from the Imperial Palace, hunting threats that the Hunters had not been able to contain, and the Primarch Rebude Gilliman returned, reorganizing the Imperial response in ways that made many of the institution's existing approaches outdated in a single decision. Among those reforms was a formal recall of the Sisters of Silence, the all-female force whose psychic absence had made them irreplaceable during the Heresy, and whose centuries of near total obscurity had cost the organization dearly. Their return under Gilliman's authority brought back a capability the Holy Orders had quietly needed for generations and had never adequately replaced. Inquisitorial elements were incorporated into broader military campaigns as part of a strategy the organization had not designed and was not directing. And for the first time in 10,000 years, the most powerful order in the Imperium was operating inside someone else's plan rather than its own. Then, through one of of the intelligence channels that had survived the collapse of the wider network, the witch hunter received a technical assessment that had been circulating quietly among the highest levels of the hierarchy, failing at a rate that suggested complete collapse within a century or perhaps within a decade. The Golden Throne offered no solution in its projections, only numbers. An organization that had spent 10,000 years believing there was nothing it could not manage had finally found the one problem it could not solve, and the senior agent who had just executed one of the most experienced operatives in the Imperium for trying to fix that problem stood alone reading confirmation that the problem could not be fixed at all. Chapter 7. Legacy of Control. Somewhere on the throne world, in a chamber that carried no official name in any record accessible to the public, a newly sealed agent stood alone with the weight of what she had just been told. She had spent 3 years in preparation for this moment, moving through gradual tests and mounting responsibilities under a mentor who never explained the full scope of what she was being trained for. Now she had her seal, and she had been told what it meant to carry it in the 42nd millennium. The beacon her organization had protected for 10,000 years was now failing. The galaxy had been torn in two, and citizens of the Imperium already knew what walked in the dark, because they had seen it with their own eyes. Joining an organization that had outlasted every threat it had ever faced, she was also joining one that had become one of the most dangerous things humanity had ever produced. From the very first day, the institution had been built on a conflict it could never fully resolve. And that was what the seal had always meant. 10,000 years of hunting every threat imaginable had turned the Holy Orders into one of the most dangerous forces in the galaxy. Not dangerous only to the enemies of humanity, but dangerous to the Imperium itself, to the people it claimed to protect, and to the agents it sent out to do the work. Survival came from the fact that the organization was never fully unified in the first place. Its factions fought each other and pursued opposing goals, and authority was applied so differently across a million worlds that no single failure could bring the whole structure down at once. What made the institution nearly impossible to govern was the same quality that made it nearly impossible to destroy. Codex Inquisition confirms that one internal branch spent its entire existence trying to uncover 10,000 years of buried records and conflicts, trying to establish what had actually happened at the founding, while another branch worked just as actively to keep those same origins buried, arguing that the enemies of humanity should never gain the advantage of understanding where the organization came from. Neither branch had any interest in resolving it, because the conflict itself was part of how the sealed orders protected themselves from outside examination. Among those still carrying the founding conflict into the 42nd millennium, the Promeans continued their 10,000-year search, descended directly from the founder who had refused her methods and built a dedicated group to oppose the danger she represented. They had survived the centuries by absorbing new purpose when the original trail went cold. Still looking for a path to the Emperor's restoration, they carried the founding question that the institution itself had never answered. What had begun with two founders walking away from each other in the silence after the Siege of Terra had never stopped. In the 42nd millennium, it continued in the same darkness it had always occupied, pursued by people who believed in it the same way the original founder had, and who had never been given a reason to stop. Both the Eisenhorn and Ravenor stories address the human cost of the mission more honestly than most official accounts allowed, binding a demon inside a human body to stop an enemy who could not be stopped any other way. The veteran agent's former peers eventually declared him a heretic for it, serving from within a sealed container that kept a destroyed body alive so a still functional mind could keep working. His former student refused to stop, even when continuing cost him everything ordinary life might have offered. Not stories of triumph or failure in any simple sense, they were stories of people doing an impossible job because stopping would mean allowing something worse to happen, and the institution they served had no system for letting people stop even when the work was destroying them. Somewhere on Terra, at that same moment, another mentor was sitting across from another new operative, handing over a seal and explaining what the job required, using the same words every mentor before them had used, because the job had not changed and the institution had no mechanism for acknowledging what it cost. The storyline Watchers of the Throne, the Emperor's Legion, further details that the institution's hold over all other imperial bodies remained consistent even as those bodies changed around it. a planetary governor who woke each morning knowing an agent could walk through his door before noon, governed differently than one who did not. A Space Marine chapter master who had watched a peer's warriors face review after a disputed engagement negotiated every subsequent disagreement with that memory present. Presence in a room was not required to shape what happened there. History was enough. Protecting humanity in ways that humanity was never permitted to know about, the organization had never found a way to replace the weight of that history with something that could hold a civilization together over generations rather than simply hold it in place. Codex Imperial Agents notes that by the early 42nd millennium, the institution was at its most needed and most overwhelmed at the same time, having lost the comfort of operating in the shadows because the shadows themselves had changed. On the throne world, Krall received another report. A different world, a different threat, the same absence of anyone else positioned to act on it. Around him, the organization continued its internal conflicts as though the galaxy had not been torn in two. Agents working against each other in the shadows of a war, they were all nominally fighting together. The throne was still failing. The Great Rift was still open. Somewhere in the galaxy, the Promeans were still searching, carrying the founding question that had never been answered, and still believing an answer existed if they could only find the right place to look. None of them, from the senior agent reading his report to the newest operative standing alone with a freshly granted seal, could say with certainty whether the thing they served was still the protection it had been built to be, or whether it had become the very thing the Imperium most needed to be saved from. That weight did not stay with the senior agents and the sealed orders alone. It was carried into the darkest corners of the galaxy by the warriors sent there on their behalf, and no group carried it further or paid a higher price than the Death Watch, the alien hunters who served under the sealed orders and saw more of what the universe truly was than anyone else in it. The enemies they spent 10,000 years hunting are a story in themselves, and the 8 levels of Chaos Space Marines show exactly what the institution was built to stop.